In the digital age, a single sentence can destroy a career, end friendships, and divide nations. What happens when that sentence involves a beloved child prince, spoken by someone the public once trusted? This is the story of how 7 words changed everything, and whether the storm that followed was justice or madness. The question isn't whether John Thompson meant harm when he made his comment about 10-year-old Prince George during a live television interview. The question is whether what happened next revealed the best or worst of human nature. Some called it accountability. Others called it a witch hunt. But everyone had an opinion about what those 7 words really meant, and whether the punishment fit the crime. This is the true story of how a moment of poor judgment became a national obsession, tearing apart families, ending careers, and forcing everyone to ask, in our rush to protect innocence, did we lose our own? John Thompson had been having the best week of his professional life until Tuesday morning arrived. As a respected political commentator for Britain's Channel 7 News, he had just signed a new 3-year contract worth more than he had ever imagined earning. His morning show Thompson's Take had consistently high ratings, and his social media following had grown to over 2 million people who hung on his every word about current events and royal affairs. That Tuesday started like any other. John arrived at the television studio at 5 in the morning, his usual coffee in hand, reviewing his notes for the day's broadcast. The royal family had been in the news recently due to Prince William and Catherine's upcoming charity gala, and John's producer, Sarah Mitchell, had suggested they discuss the event and the growing public interest in the young royals. John had built his career on being provocative but thoughtful. He prided himself on saying things others wouldn't dare, but always with intelligence and purpose behind his words. His audience loved him for his honesty and his willingness to challenge conventional thinking about politics, society, and, yes, even the royal family. As he sat in the makeup chair, John chatted casually with Maria Santos, the makeup artist who had worked with him for 3 years. They talked about their children, weekend plans, and the latest celebrity gossip. Maria mentioned how her 8-year-old daughter was fascinated by Prince George and had asked if she could meet him someday. Kids that age are so innocent, Maria said while applying foundation to John's face. They don't understand the pressure these royal children must be under. John nodded, but his mind was already shifting to the show. He had been thinking about a particular angle for discussing the royals that morning, something about how the media's intense focus on the children might affect their development. It was a topic he felt passionate about, having 2 children of his own. The studio was buzzing with its usual pre-show energy when John took his place behind the news desk. The cameras were being adjusted, sound levels checked, and the teleprompter loaded with the day's scripts. Sarah approached him with some last-minute notes about the royal segment. "Remember, keep it respectful," she said, though she had never needed to remind John of this before. The audience loves when you talk about the royals, but they also get sensitive about the children. John waved her off with a confident smile. "Sarah, you know me. I've got this." The red light came on at exactly 7 o'clock, and John looked directly into camera 1 with the same professional demeanor that had made him one of Britain's most trusted morning voices. "Good morning, I'm John Thompson, and this is Thompson's Take. Today we're discussing the upcoming charity gala hosted by the Prince and Princess of Wales, and I have some thoughts about how we as a society treat our royal children." For the first 20 minutes of the show, everything went perfectly. John discussed the charity work, interviewed a guest about youth programs, and seamlessly transitioned into talking about the younger generation of royals. His comments were thoughtful and well-received, exactly the kind of content that had made him successful. But then, something shifted. Perhaps it was the comfort of live television, or maybe the passion he felt about protecting children from media scrutiny, but John decided to go off script. He leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the more personal tone his audience had come to love. "You know, I look at Prince George, and I see a 10-year-old boy who's going to grow up in ways we can't imagine. The pressure, the expectations, the constant watching. Sometimes I wonder if we're setting these children up for problems we don't even understand yet." He paused, and, in that pause, something unfortunate happened. Instead of moving to his prepared conclusion about the need for media responsibility, John's mind wandered to a conversation he had overheard the previous weekend. At his daughter's soccer game, some parents had been discussing celebrities and their children, making crude jokes about how kids of famous people often turn out. Without thinking, John continued, "I mean, look at him now, he seems like a sweet kid, but you have to wonder if he'll turn out to be completely messed up." The moment the words left his mouth, John felt a sinking sensation in his stomach. In the control room, Sarah's face went pale. The camera operator's eyebrows shot up. Even the sound technician, who had heard thousands of hours of live television, looked surprised. John tried to recover immediately. "What I mean is, the pressure of royal life can be incredibly difficult for anyone, especially children, and we should be mindful of that as we discuss these young people in the media." But it was too late. Those 7 words, "you have to wonder if he'll turn out to be completely messed up," were already traveling through fiber optic cables and satellite signals to millions of homes across Britain and beyond. In living rooms, kitchens, and offices, people stopped what they were doing. Some replayed the segment on their digital devices, wanting to make sure they had heard correctly. Others immediately reached for their phones. Margaret Chen, a teacher from Manchester, was getting her 2 young children ready for school when she heard the comment. She dropped the lunchbox she was packing and stared at the television screen. "Did he just say what I think he said about Prince George?" she asked her husband, David, who was equally shocked. Meanwhile, at Buckingham Palace, the royal press office was already receiving phone calls. Private Secretary Timothy Walsh was in the middle of reviewing the day's schedule when his assistant knocked on his door. "Sir, we're getting calls about something John Thompson said on television this morning." "About Prince George?" Timothy had been managing royal communications for 15 years. He had handled countless media storms, from paparazzi incidents to political controversies. But something about his assistant's tone made him immediately concerned. Back at the Channel 7 studio, John finished his show with what he hoped was professional composure, but inside, his mind was racing. During the commercial breaks, he could see Sarah having intense conversations with other producers. When the show finally ended, she approached him with an expression he had never seen before. "John, we need to talk. Now." They walked to Sarah's office in silence, passing colleagues who seemed to be avoiding eye contact. Sarah closed the door and immediately pulled up Twitter on her computer screen. "It's already trending," she said quietly. "John Thompson, Prince George. Look at this." The tweets were multiplying by the minute. Some defended John, saying he was taken out of context. But many more were expressing outrage and disbelief. Parents were particularly vocal, with many saying they felt sick to their stomachs that anyone would speculate about a child's future in such a negative way. One tweet that would later be shared thousands of times read, "John Thompson just called a 10-year-old future king messed up on live TV. This man has lost his mind and should lose his job." #RespectRoyalChildren. Another simply said, "If you can say this about Prince George on television, what are you saying about regular children behind closed doors?" #FireJohnThompson. John sat in Sarah's office, watching his professional world begin to crumble in real time. His phone was buzzing constantly with calls from journalists, friends, and family members. His wife had already sent 3 text messages asking if he was okay and whether she should come to the studio. "Sarah, it was a poor choice of words," John said, his voice strained. "I was trying to make a point about media pressure on royal children. I would never intentionally say anything hurtful about Prince George or any child." Sarah nodded, but her expression remained serious. "I know that, John. I've worked with you for years, and I know your heart. But perception is reality in our business, and right now, the perception is very, very bad." As they spoke, Channel 7's director of communications was fielding calls from other media outlets wanting statements and responses. The royal press office was maintaining dignified silence, but their lack of immediate comment was being interpreted by some as evidence that the palace was considering its options. By noon, the story had spread beyond social media and television news. Radio stations were playing clips of John's comment, newspapers were preparing articles for their evening editions, and international outlets were beginning to pick up the story. John spent the afternoon in meetings with network executives, lawyers, and public relations specialists. Everyone agreed that an apology was necessary, but there was intense debate about the format and timing. Some argued for an immediate statement, others worried that rushing into an apology might make things worse. At 3 o'clock, John was asked to write a personal statement explaining his comments. He sat alone in a conference room, staring at a blank piece of paper, trying to find words that would undo the damage without making it worse. He wrote and rewrote his apology dozens of times. How do you explain that a comment about a child was meant to protect children? How do you convey genuine remorse without admitting to intentions you never had? Meanwhile, the story was developing its own momentum. Parenting groups were issuing statements condemning John's remarks. Child psychology experts were being interviewed about the potential impact of such comments on young people. Political commentators were debating whether John's words reflected broader problems with media coverage of the royal family. By evening, John's comment had been discussed on every major news program in Britain. The clip had been viewed millions of times online, and #RoyalRespect was trending alongside #FireJohnThompson. At home that night, John sat with his wife, Emily, and their 2 children, trying to explain what had happened without frightening them. His 12-year-old daughter, Sophie, had already heard about it from friends at school. "Dad, did you really say something mean about Prince George?" she asked, her eyes wide with confusion. John looked at his daughter, seeing the innocence and trust in her expression, and felt the full weight of his mistake. He had built his career on his ability to communicate clearly and thoughtfully, and now his own child was questioning whether he was the person she thought he was. "I said something that came out wrong, sweetheart," he told her. "I was trying to talk about how hard it must be for Prince George to grow up with everyone watching him, but I used words that sounded mean when I didn't mean them that way." Emily squeezed his hand supportively, but he could see the worry in her eyes. They both understood that this wasn't just about one comment anymore. It was about their family's future, their financial security, and John's entire professional identity. As the day ended, John lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying those 7 words over and over in his mind. He thought about Prince George, probably asleep in his room at Adelaide Cottage, unaware that millions of adults were arguing about him. He thought about his own children, who might face ridicule at school because of their father's mistake. Most of all, he wondered whether what was coming next would be justice for a thoughtless comment, or something much more destructive. The answer would reveal itself in the days to come, but already, John Thompson's life would never be the same. Wednesday morning brought no relief for John Thompson. If anything, the situation had intensified overnight like a storm gathering strength. When he woke at 5:30, his phone showed 847 missed calls and thousands of social media notifications. His wife Emily was already awake, sitting at their kitchen table with her laptop, her face illuminated by the screen's glow. "It's everywhere," she said softly, not looking up. BBC, Sky News, The Guardian, The Telegraph. Even the American networks are covering it. John poured himself coffee with shaking hands and sat beside his wife. Together, they read headlines that seemed to grow more dramatic with each publication: TV host's shocking attack on Prince George, royal child targeted by cruel comments, and when did we start bullying 10-year-olds on television? The BBC's royal correspondent had filed a particularly damaging report, describing John's comment as an unprecedented attack on a child who cannot defend himself. Sky News had assembled a panel of child psychologists, royal experts, and media ethicists, all discussing the broader implications of John's words. But it was the personal stories that cut deepest. Parents across the country were sharing their own experiences of having their children criticized or mocked by adults. Social media was flooded with messages from mothers and fathers expressing their anger not just at John's comment, but at what they saw as a culture that allowed adults to speak carelessly about children. Rachel Morrison, a nurse from Edinburgh, had posted a video that was being shared thousands of times. In it, she spoke directly to her phone's camera while her young son played in the background. "I watched John Thompson's show yesterday, and I felt sick," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Prince George is the same age as my son. Can you imagine how that little boy would feel if he heard what this grown man said about him? And if this is what people say about a prince on television, what are they saying about our children when we're not listening?" The video had struck a nerve because it connected John's comment to something much larger: parents' deepest fears about their children being judged, criticized, or hurt by adults who should know better. At Channel 7, the crisis management team had worked through the night. The network's reputation was at stake, and executives were feeling pressure from advertisers, viewers, and their own employees. By Wednesday morning, 3 major sponsors had already pulled their advertisements from John's show, citing concerns about being associated with content that targets children. Network president James Hartwell called an emergency meeting for 8 o'clock. John arrived at the studio to find photographers waiting outside, their cameras flashing as he hurried through the entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was tense and professional, but he could feel the weight of everyone's stares. The meeting included lawyers, public relations specialists, and senior executives, all seated around a polished conference table that reflected the fluorescent lights above. James Hartwell, a man who had navigated countless media crises in his 20-year career, looked directly at John with an expression that offered no comfort. "John, we need to address this situation immediately and comprehensively," Hartwell began. "The network's position is clear. What you said yesterday was inappropriate and does not reflect our values. We need to discuss how we move forward." John had prepared his defense, but sitting in that room, surrounded by lawyers and executives, his carefully planned words seemed inadequate. "James, I want to be absolutely clear that my comment was taken out of context. I was discussing the pressures of growing up in the public eye, not making any personal attack on Prince George. I have the utmost respect for the royal family and would never intentionally harm a child with my words." The head of legal affairs, Patricia Williams, consulted her notes before responding. "John, the issue isn't your intention. The issue is public perception and potential legal ramifications. We've already received communications from lawyers representing parties who feel the royal family has been defamed. While we believe we can defend against any legal action, the damage to our brand and credibility is significant." As the meeting continued, John realized that his explanations, while true from his perspective, weren't changing anyone's mind. The executives weren't necessarily unsympathetic, but they were operating in crisis management mode, focused on protecting the network rather than protecting him. Meanwhile, at Kensington Palace, Prince William and Catherine were dealing with their own crisis. Their private secretary had briefed them on the situation, and they were consulting with communications experts about how to respond. The challenge was complex. Any response that seemed too strong might draw more attention to the controversy, but remaining silent could be interpreted as acceptance of John's comment. The royal couple's primary concern, however, wasn't public relations but their son's well-being. Prince George was old enough to understand that something was happening, especially when his parents' schedule suddenly changed and additional security measures were implemented. Catherine had the difficult task of explaining to her son why people were talking about him on television without revealing the hurtful nature of the comments. "Sometimes adults say things they don't mean, and it can cause confusion," she told him gently. "But you are loved and protected, and nothing anyone says can change how wonderful you are." Prince William, meanwhile, was struggling with his own emotions. As a father, he felt a protective anger that he couldn't express publicly. As a future king, he understood the need for dignified restraint. The tension between these two roles was evident to everyone around him. Back in the media storm, new voices were joining the debate. Child development experts were explaining how public criticism could affect a young person's mental health. Legal analysts were discussing whether John's comment constituted defamation. Media ethicists were questioning whether television personalities had a special responsibility to be careful when discussing public figures, especially children. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a child psychologist at Cambridge University, gave an interview that would become central to the debate. When adults make negative predictions about a child's future, especially in such a public forum, it can have lasting psychological effects, she explained. Children internalize these messages, and even if Prince George never hears the comment directly, the very fact that it was said publicly contributes to a culture where it's acceptable to speculate negatively about young people's futures. Her words were quoted extensively and seemed to provide scientific backing for the public's emotional response to John's comment. Parents shared her interview thousands of times, saying it articulated exactly why they felt so disturbed by what had happened. As Wednesday progressed, the story began to take on international dimensions. American television networks picked up the controversy, with several hosts comparing it to similar incidents involving celebrity children in the United States. European media covered it as an example of British tabloid culture's impact on more serious journalism. But, perhaps most significantly, ordinary people were using John's comment as a starting point for much larger conversations about how society treats children, especially those in the public eye. Teachers were discussing it in staff meetings, parents were talking about it at school pickup, and children themselves were beginning to ask questions about what adults were allowed to say about them. John spent Wednesday afternoon recording multiple apology videos, each one carefully reviewed by legal and public relations teams. The process was exhausting and humiliating. Every word was scrutinized for potential additional offenses or admissions of guilt. His final apology, recorded at 4 o'clock, was a carefully crafted statement that expressed remorse without acknowledging malicious intent. "I sincerely apologize for my thoughtless comment about Prince George. My words were inappropriate and did not reflect my true feelings about this young member of the royal family. I have great respect for Prince George and all children, and I deeply regret any hurt my words may have caused." The apology was released simultaneously across all of Channel 7's platforms and John's personal social media accounts. Within minutes, it was being analyzed, criticized, and debated. Some felt it was sincere and sufficient, others argued it was too little, too late. The royal family's response came 2 hours later, delivered through their official communications office. "The Prince and Princess of Wales appreciate the apology and consider the matter closed. They ask for privacy for their family during this time." The statement was brief and dignified, exactly what royal watchers expected. But it didn't end the controversy. If anything, it shifted the focus from whether John should apologize to whether his apology was adequate and what consequences, if any, he should face. By Wednesday evening, petitions were circulating online calling for John's dismissal from Channel 7. Counter-petitions defending him and arguing for forgiveness were also gaining signatures. The comment that had lasted 7 words and 7 seconds was now dominating news cycles and dividing public opinion. John returned home that evening to find his family under siege. Photographers were positioned across from their house, and neighbors were being approached by journalists seeking comments about John's character. His children couldn't play in their own backyard without the risk of being photographed. Emily had spent the day fielding calls from reporters, old friends, and concerned family members. Their extended family was split in their reactions. Some were supportive and understanding, while others were embarrassed and critical. "My sister thinks you should resign immediately," Emily told John as they sat in their living room with the curtains drawn. "She says it's the only way to show real accountability." "And what do you think?" John asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Emily was quiet for a long moment. "I think you made a mistake. A big one. But I also think this reaction is becoming something much bigger than what you actually said. It's like people needed someone to be angry at, and you gave them a reason." That night, John couldn't sleep. He found himself thinking not just about his own future, but about the broader questions his situation had raised. Had his comment really been as harmful as people claimed? Was the public reaction proportionate to his mistake? And, most troubling of all, was this how society should handle situations where someone said something thoughtless but not malicious? The answers would become clearer in the coming days, but already it was obvious that John Thompson's 7 words had unleashed something much larger than a simple apology could contain. The storm was just beginning. By Thursday, the John Thompson controversy had evolved far beyond a simple case of an inappropriate comment. Battle lines were being drawn across British society, with people taking increasingly polarized positions not just about John's words, but about deeper questions of accountability, forgiveness, and how public figures should be treated when they make mistakes. The morning newspapers reflected this division starkly. The Daily Mail ran a front-page headline reading "No Forgiveness for Child Attacker," alongside an analysis piece arguing that John's apology was insufficient and that he should face serious consequences. The Telegraph, meanwhile, published an editorial titled "When Apologies Should Be Enough," arguing that the reaction to John's comment was disproportionate and potentially dangerous for free speech. These weren't just different opinions about the same incident. They represented fundamentally different views about justice, responsibility, and human nature. Some people saw John's situation as a clear case of accountability, a public figure had said something harmful about a child and should face consequences that matched the severity of his words. Others saw it as an example of mob justice. A good man had made one mistake and was being destroyed by people who had never made similar errors. Dr. Michael Roberts, a sociology professor at Oxford University, found himself in the unusual position of being contacted by multiple news outlets seeking academic perspective on what was happening. His analysis would become influential in how people understood the broader implications of the controversy. What we're witnessing, Dr. Roberts explained to the BBC, is a perfect example of how social media can amplify moral emotions to dangerous levels. John Thompson made a thoughtless comment, but the response has become about much more than his actual words. People are using his situation to express their feelings about child protection, media responsibility, and social justice more broadly. His observation was prescient. Across the country, John's comment was being discussed in contexts that had little to do with Prince George or even the royal family. Parent-teacher association meetings were turning into debates about how adults should speak about children. Social media groups focused on various causes were using John's situation to illustrate their broader points about society and morality. At Channel 7, the pressure was mounting from multiple directions. Advertisers were continuing to withdraw their support, not just from John's show but from other programs as well. 3 major companies had issued statements saying they couldn't be associated with a network that employed someone who had attacked a child, regardless of Channel 7's official response. More significantly, some of the network's own employees were expressing discomfort with John's continued presence. A group of junior staff members had written a letter to management arguing that keeping John on the air sent the wrong message about the network's values. The letter wasn't made public, but word of its existence leaked to industry publications, creating additional pressure. James Hartwell, the network president, was facing the most difficult decision of his career. John Thompson had been a valuable asset to Channel 7 for 6 years, consistently delivering high ratings and revenue. But the controversy was threatening to damage the entire network's reputation and financial stability. On Thursday afternoon, Hartwell called a meeting with the network's board of directors. The discussion was intense and sometimes heated, revealing fundamental disagreements about how media companies should respond to public relations crises. Board member Susan Clark argued for immediate termination. "We cannot allow one person's mistake to destroy the reputation we've built over decades." John Thompson made his choice when he decided to speculate publicly about a child's future. Now we need to make our choice to protect this company. However, board member David Foster disagreed. "If we fire John for one inappropriate comment, especially after he's apologized, what message does that send about how we treat our employees? And what precedent does it set for future situations? Are we going to fire every presenter who makes a mistake?" The debate reflected broader societal divisions about accountability and consequences. Some board members felt that in the current social climate, the network had no choice but to take strong action. Others worried about setting a precedent that would make it impossible for anyone to work in public-facing roles without the constant fear of career destruction over single mistakes. Meanwhile, John was experiencing the personal toll of being at the center of a national controversy. He had stopped reading social media entirely after encountering messages that went far beyond criticism of his comment to personal attacks on his character, family, and even his appearance. Some people were posting his home address and encouraging others to let him know what they thought of his words. His children were bearing an unexpected burden as well. 12-year-old Sophie had been confronted at school by classmates who had heard their parents discussing her father. Some children were cruel in the way that only children can be, repeating harsh judgments they had overheard without understanding their full meaning. 8-year-old Marcus was too young to understand the complexities of the situation, but he could sense the tension in his home and the change in his parents' behavior. He began having trouble sleeping and asked his mother repeatedly whether his father was in trouble. Emily Thompson found herself managing not just her own emotions but serving as a buffer between her family and the outside world. She had taken time off from her job as a marketing manager to handle the constant stream of phone calls, emails, and unexpected visitors. The stress was affecting her health, but she felt she had no choice but to hold everything together. The situation was made more difficult by the reactions of people in their community. Some neighbors had been supportive, bringing meals and offering assistance. But others had made their disapproval clear, with one neighbor telling Emily directly that she was embarrassed to live on the same street as someone who would attack a child. These personal interactions revealed how John's comment had become a kind of moral test for people. Supporting him was seen by some as condoning his words, while criticizing him was viewed by others as participating in mob mentality. There seemed to be no middle ground for nuanced positions. On Thursday evening, an unexpected development changed the dynamics of the entire controversy. Prince Harry, speaking at a charity event for children's mental health, made brief comments that were interpreted by many as referring to John's situation. Children should be protected from adult judgments and adult mistakes, Prince Harry said during his speech. When grown-ups use their platforms to speculate about young people's futures, especially in negative ways, they forget that children are listening. Words have power, and those of us with public voices have a responsibility to use that power carefully. Prince Harry didn't mention John Thompson by name, and his spokesman later clarified that the comments were about children's issues generally. But, in the context of the week's events, many people interpreted the statement as a royal family member weighing in on the controversy. The impact was immediate and significant. John's supporters argued that Prince Harry's comments were inappropriate interference in a matter that his brother and sister-in-law had already declared closed. His critics saw them as validation of their position that John's comment was indeed harmful and deserved continued attention. The royal family's communications office found itself in the uncomfortable position of trying to clarify that Prince Harry's comments weren't specifically about John Thompson while not completely contradicting the obvious connections people were making. The situation highlighted the challenges the royal family faced in addressing the controversy without seeming either too passive or too involved. That evening, John received an unexpected phone call from his mentor, Robert Sterling, a veteran broadcaster who had helped launch John's career. Robert had been watching the situation develop with growing concern, not just for John personally but for the broader implications for journalism and public discourse. "John, I've seen a lot of careers destroyed in my 40 years in this business," Robert said. "Some deserved it, others didn't. What's happening to you is bigger than what you actually said. People are using your situation to fight battles that have nothing to do with you." Robert's perspective was informed by decades of experience with media controversies. He had seen how public reactions to individual incidents often reflected deeper social tensions and anxieties. In John's case, he believed the reaction was being driven by parents' fears about their children's safety, society's concerns about media responsibility, and political divisions about accountability and forgiveness. "The question isn't whether you made a mistake," Robert continued. "You did, and you've acknowledged that. The question is whether the response is proportionate and whether it's helping anyone, including Prince George." This last point was becoming increasingly relevant. Child psychologists and royal watchers were beginning to express concern that the extended controversy was bringing more negative attention to Prince George than John's original comment had. Every day of continued debate meant another day of his name being associated with negative discussions. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a child development specialist, wrote an op-ed for The Guardian arguing that the ongoing controversy was potentially more harmful to Prince George than John's original words had been. "We've created a situation where this child's name is associated with conflict and negativity in millions of conversations," she wrote. "Our efforts to protect him may be causing exactly the kind of harmful attention we claim to oppose." Her article was shared widely and began to shift some public opinion. People started questioning whether their outrage was actually helping Prince George or making his situation worse. This created an additional layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. As Thursday night ended, John found himself in his study, looking at framed photos of his family and trying to make sense of what had happened to his life. A week ago, he had been a successful television presenter with a secure future and a happy family. Now he was at the center of a national debate about morality, consequences, and the limits of public accountability. He realized that regardless of what happened to his career, the controversy had already changed him and his family permanently. His children would grow up knowing that their father had been at the center of a national scandal. His wife would always remember the stress and fear of this week. And he would never again speak publicly without remembering the power of words to create consequences far beyond what anyone could anticipate. The most troubling realization was that everyone seemed to have an opinion about what should happen to him, but very few people seemed interested in the more difficult questions his situation raised. How should society handle mistakes made by public figures? What level of accountability is appropriate for thoughtless but not malicious comments? And how can people distinguish between justice and revenge when emotions are running high? These questions would become even more urgent in the days to come, as the controversy entered its most intense and consequential phase. Friday morning brought the news that John Thompson and his family had been dreading. James Hartwell called John at 6:30, his voice formal and strained, to inform him that Channel 7's board of directors had made their decision after an emergency late-night meeting. "John, this is one of the most difficult calls I've ever had to make," Hartwell began. "The board has decided that we need to part ways, effective immediately. Your contract is being terminated, and we'll be making a public announcement at 9 this morning." John felt the words hit him like a physical blow. Even though he had known this was a possibility, hearing it confirmed felt surreal and devastating. "James, we've worked together for 6 years. I've built my entire career at Channel 7. Isn't there any way we can work through this?" Hartwell's voice carried genuine regret, but also firm resolve. "John, this isn't about your talent or your value as a broadcaster. It's about the reality of the situation we're facing. We've lost major advertisers, we're getting pressure from regulators, and, frankly, some of our own staff are uncomfortable. The board feels we don't have a choice." The conversation continued for several more minutes, covering practical matters like final payments, health insurance, and the return of company property. But John barely heard the details. His mind was reeling from the realization that his career, built over 15 years in broadcasting, was ending because of 7 thoughtless words. After hanging up, John sat in his kitchen staring at his coffee cup, trying to process what had just happened. Emily found him there an hour later, and the look on his face told her everything she needed to know. "They fired you," she said, sitting down beside him. John nodded, unable to trust his voice. Emily took his hand, and they sat in silence, both understanding that their lives had just changed fundamentally. John's salary had been their family's primary income. Their mortgage, their children's school fees, their plans for the future, all of it was now in jeopardy. At 9 o'clock, Channel 7 released their statement. "After careful consideration, Channel 7 and John Thompson have mutually agreed to end their professional relationship. We thank John for his years of service and wish him well in his future endeavors. Channel 7 remains committed to responsible broadcasting and maintaining the trust of our viewers." The phrase "mutually agreed" fooled no one. Industry insiders and media watchers immediately understood that John had been fired, and the story dominated news coverage throughout the morning. The reaction to John's termination was as divided as everything else about the controversy had been. Many people expressed satisfaction that there had finally been meaningful consequences for his comment about Prince George. Parents groups issued statements praising Channel 7 for doing the right thing and showing that attacking children has real consequences. However, others were troubled by what they saw as a disproportionate response. Several prominent journalists and media personalities expressed concern about the precedent being set. If a broadcaster could lose their career over one inappropriate comment followed by an apology, what did that mean for freedom of expression and the ability of media personalities to take risks or express controversial opinions? Marcus Wellington, a respected veteran of British broadcasting, wrote an op-ed for The Times that captured many people's concerns. "John Thompson said something stupid and hurtful. No one disputes that. But firing him destroys a career over a mistake that harmed no one directly and for which he sincerely apologized. When did we decide that single errors in judgment should result in professional death sentences?" The debate was further complicated by the emergence of John's employment history and character references. Colleagues who had worked with him for years came forward to describe him as a dedicated professional and loving father who had never before shown any signs of the callousness his critics attributed to him. Maria Santos, the makeup artist who had chatted with John the morning he made his comment, gave an interview to the Evening Standard that provided additional context. John was talking about how hard it must be for royal children to grow up in the public eye. He's always been someone who cares about protecting kids. What he said came out wrong, but I know his heart, and it wasn't coming from a bad place. Her account was supported by other Channel 7 employees who described John as someone who regularly participated in charity events for children and had often used his platform to advocate for young people's welfare. This created cognitive dissonance for some of his critics, who had difficulty reconciling the thoughtless comment with the broader pattern of his behavior. The royal family, meanwhile, was dealing with their own complications from the ongoing controversy. Despite their statement that they considered the matter closed, the continued public attention was making it impossible for them to move on. Prince George was beginning to ask questions about why his name kept appearing in news reports, and his parents were struggling with how to explain the situation age-appropriately. More significantly, the controversy was affecting the royal family's broader work. Their upcoming charity gala, which should have been receiving positive media attention for its important cause, was instead being overshadowed by discussions about John Thompson's comment and termination. Prince William, in particular, was growing frustrated with the situation. In private conversations with palace staff, he expressed concern that the extended controversy was achieving the opposite of what people claimed to want. Instead of protecting his son, it was keeping Prince George's name in negative headlines day after day. "This has become about everything except my son's well-being," William reportedly told a senior aide. "People are using his name to fight their own battles, and that's exactly what we wanted to prevent." Catherine was dealing with the practical challenges of helping Prince George understand why security measures had been increased and why his parents seemed more tense than usual. The 10-year-old was sophisticated enough to sense that something significant was happening but young enough to worry that he had done something wrong. As Friday progressed, new voices began entering the debate from unexpected directions. Mental health advocates pointed out that the intense scrutiny and public shaming John was experiencing could have serious psychological consequences. Some noted the irony that efforts to protect one child's mental health might be causing significant harm to another family's mental health. Dr. James Parker, a psychiatrist specializing in public shaming and social media harassment, wrote an analysis that was published in several outlets. "We need to consider the psychological impact of sustained public criticism on individuals and their families. John Thompson made a mistake, but the level of hatred and vitriol directed at him and his family goes far beyond anything that could be considered proportionate or therapeutic." His analysis included research showing that public shaming campaigns, even when directed at people who had made genuine mistakes, often caused lasting psychological damage not just to the targets but to their family members, particularly children. This perspective began to resonate with some people who had initially supported strong consequences for John. The realization that his children were experiencing bullying and harassment at school because of their father's mistake troubled many parents who had originally seen John's situation as a simple matter of accountability. Sophie Thompson, John's 12-year-old daughter, had become particularly withdrawn as the week progressed. She was old enough to understand that her father was being criticized nationally, and several of her classmates had made cruel comments about it. Her teacher, Mrs. Rebecca Hayes, contacted the school counselor after Sophie broke down crying during a lesson about current events. "Sophie is a bright, sensitive child who's clearly struggling with this situation," Mrs. Hayes reported. "She asked me yesterday whether her father was a bad person, and I didn't know what to tell her. This controversy is hurting innocent children, and that seems to contradict what people claim they're trying to achieve." The school's response illustrated another dimension of the controversy's impact. Educational institutions were struggling with how to handle discussions about the situation, especially when students whose parents held different views came into conflict. Some parents wanted the incident used as a teaching moment about responsibility and consequences. Others felt that continuing to discuss it in schools was unnecessarily prolonging children's exposure to negative content. Teachers found themselves in the impossible position of trying to address current events while protecting students from content that might be disturbing or divisive. By Friday evening, John was beginning to understand the full scope of what had happened to him. The termination of his contract was just the beginning. Several speaking engagements had been cancelled, a book deal he had been negotiating was withdrawn, and preliminary discussions about a documentary project had ended abruptly. More devastatingly, he was beginning to realize that his reputation might be permanently damaged. Internet searches for his name now return thousands of articles about the Prince George controversy. Future employers would inevitably discover this history, making it difficult or impossible for him to return to broadcasting or any other public-facing role. The economic impact on his family was immediate and severe. Emily calculated that they could maintain their current lifestyle for approximately 3 months before serious financial hardship set in. They would need to consider selling their house, changing their children's schools, and fundamentally restructuring their lives. That evening, John received a call that surprised him. Robert Dalton, a journalist from The Guardian who had been covering the controversy, wanted to do an in-depth interview about John's experience and perspective. Unlike the quick statements and comments that had dominated the week's coverage, this would be an opportunity for John to tell his side of the story comprehensively. "I'm interested in the broader questions your situation raises," Dalton explained. "About proportionality, about how we handle mistakes in the digital age, about the difference between accountability and destruction." John was tempted by the opportunity to defend himself and provide context for his comments. But he was also aware that any interview could be risky. His lawyers had advised him to avoid detailed public statements that might create new controversies or legal vulnerabilities. As he considered Dalton's offer, John found himself thinking about Prince George. The controversy had supposedly been about protecting that 10-year-old boy from harmful comment. But had it actually protected him? Or had it created a situation where his name was associated with conflict and negativity in millions of conversations? The question was becoming increasingly relevant as critics began to argue that the extended controversy was achieving the opposite of its stated goals. Instead of protecting Prince George from inappropriate attention, it was ensuring that his name remained in headlines and discussions week after week. This realization was beginning to shift public opinion in subtle but significant ways. People who had initially supported strong consequences for John were starting to question whether the ongoing controversy was actually helping the child it claimed to protect. As Friday night ended, John Thompson sat in his study, surrounded by the remnants of a career that had taken 15 years to build and 5 days to destroy. He realized that whatever happened next, the fundamental questions his situation had raised about accountability, forgiveness, and proportionality would outlast the immediate controversy. The most troubling thought was that in trying to protect one child from 7 thoughtless words, society had created a situation that was potentially harmful to multiple children and families. The cure, it seemed, might be worse than the disease. 6 months after John Thompson's 7 words changed everything, the world had largely moved on to other controversies and causes. But, for those most directly affected, the aftermath continued to ripple through their lives in ways both profound and unexpected. John stood in the kitchen of their smaller apartment, a modest 2-bedroom place they had moved to after selling their family home. The financial necessity had been painful, but the forced simplification of their lives had brought some unexpected benefits. His children had adjusted better than he had hoped, and Emily had found a new job that she actually preferred to her previous position. The interview with Robert Dalton from The Guardian had ultimately changed the trajectory of John's story. Published 3 weeks after his termination, it had presented a more nuanced view of both John's comment and the reaction it had provoked. Dalton had interviewed child psychologists, media ethics experts, and members of the public to explore whether the response to John's mistake had been proportionate and effective. The article, titled 7 Words, A Story of Mistakes, Accountability, and Proportionality, had won several journalism awards and sparked a broader conversation about public shaming in the digital age. More importantly for John, it had led to unexpected opportunities. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the child psychologist whose earlier comments had been used to criticize John, reached out after reading the full context of his situation. She had been disturbed to learn about the impact on John's children and wanted to discuss the broader implications of public shaming campaigns. "I realized that my comments had been used to justify something I never intended," she told John during their first conversation. "I believe in accountability, but what happened to your family goes beyond accountability into punishment that serves no constructive purpose." Their discussions had evolved into a collaborative project examining how society could better handle situations where public figures made mistakes. John's experience, combined with Dr. Warren's expertise, had resulted in a research paper and several speaking engagements at universities and media ethics conferences. The speaking opportunities had provided John with both income and purpose. His first-hand experience with public shaming, combined with his media background, made him an effective advocate for more thoughtful approaches to accountability. He wasn't arguing that mistakes shouldn't have consequences, but rather that those consequences should be proportionate and constructive rather than purely punitive. At one university lecture, a student had asked him whether he regretted making his original comment about Prince George. John's answer had become central to his ongoing work. "Of course I regret it. It was thoughtless and hurtful, and I wish I could take it back. But I also regret that our society's response to mistakes like mine often makes things worse rather than better." If the goal was to protect Prince George from inappropriate comments, did destroying my career and traumatizing my children achieve that goal? Or did it just satisfy people's need for revenge? The question had resonated with audiences because it highlighted a fundamental problem with how public controversies typically played out. The focus on punishment often overshadowed any consideration of whether the punishment actually served its stated purpose. Prince George himself had largely been shielded from the long-term effects of the controversy, though it had required careful management by his parents and the royal communications team. The palace had implemented new protocols for monitoring and responding to inappropriate comments about royal children, partly inspired by lessons learned from the John Thompson situation. Prince William had privately expressed regret about how the controversy had unfolded. While he had never approved of John's comment, he had been disturbed by the extended nature of the public discussion and its impact on multiple families. The experience had influenced how the royal family approached similar situations in the future, with a greater emphasis on quickly moving past individual incidents rather than allowing them to become prolonged controversies. Catherine had worked with child psychologists to help Prince George understand and process the experience. Now 11 years old, he had learned valuable lessons about resilience and the importance of not letting other people's words define his sense of self-worth. Ironically, the controversy that was supposed to protect him had ultimately contributed to his emotional development in positive ways. The broader media landscape had also evolved in response to the controversy. Several major networks had implemented new guidelines for discussing public figures, particularly children. Training programs for on-air personalities now included modules on the potential consequences of thoughtless comments and the importance of considering long-term impact rather than just immediate reaction. Channel 7 had faced its own reckoning. While they had initially received praise for firing John Thompson, the network later faced criticism when the full context of the situation became better understood. Some advertisers who had initially withdrawn their support returned, while others remained committed to their decision. James Hartwell, the network president who had made the decision to terminate John, had left Channel 7 4 months later for reasons officially described as pursuing new opportunities. Industry insiders understood that the network's board had been dissatisfied with how the situation had been handled, particularly after the Dalton article revealed details about the decision-making process. Sarah Mitchell, John's former producer, had been one of the most affected colleagues. She had advocated internally for John to keep his job and had felt partially responsible for the segment that led to his downfall. She eventually left television journalism to work for a non-profit organization focused on media literacy and responsible communication. The John Thompson situation taught me that we need to think more carefully about the difference between holding people accountable and destroying them, she reflected in an interview 6 months later. There has to be a middle ground between ignoring inappropriate behavior and ruining people's lives over single mistakes. For Emily and the children, the recovery had been gradual but meaningful. Sophie, now 13, had initially struggled with anger and embarrassment about her father's situation. But she had eventually become an articulate advocate for treating people with complexity and nuance rather than reducing them to their worst moments. At a school debate about social media and public shaming, Sophie had argued, "My dad said something stupid, and he was wrong. But he's not a bad person, and destroying our family didn't help Prince George or anyone else. Maybe instead of just getting angry at people who make mistakes, we should try to understand why they made them and help them do better." Her perspective had impressed teachers and classmates alike, demonstrating a level of emotional maturity that had emerged from navigating a difficult situation. Marcus, now 9, had been more resilient than expected. The experience had taught him early lessons about the complexity of human behavior and the importance of distinguishing between people's actions and their fundamental character. He had maintained his admiration for his father while understanding that adults sometimes made mistakes. The financial impact on the Thompson family had been significant but manageable. John's speaking fees, combined with Emily's new job and more modest living expenses, had allowed them to maintain stability while rebuilding their financial security. They had learned valuable lessons about resilience and the difference between wants and needs. Perhaps most significantly, the controversy had led to broader conversations about how society handles mistakes and accountability in the digital age. Academic researchers, journalists, and policymakers had used John's situation as a case study for examining the effectiveness and fairness of public shaming campaigns. Dr. Michael Roberts, the Oxford sociologist who had provided early analysis of the controversy, had published a book titled The Price of Perfection: How Digital Shame Culture Damages Everyone, that used John's case as a central example. The book had become influential in discussions about media ethics, criminal justice reform, and workplace policies. The John Thompson case perfectly illustrates how our desire for immediate accountability can override our consideration of proportionality and effectiveness, Roberts wrote. We created a system where single mistakes can result in career destruction, but we've never seriously examined whether this system actually protects the people it claims to help or creates the behavioral changes it supposedly seeks. Mental health professionals had also drawn lessons from the situation. The impact on John's family, particularly his children, had highlighted how public shaming campaigns often created collateral damage that went unnoticed and unaddressed. Dr. James Parker, the psychiatrist who had written about the psychological effects of public shaming, had used the Thompson case to develop new therapeutic approaches for families affected by public controversies. His work had helped other families navigate similar situations with less lasting trauma. On the first anniversary of his original comment, John was invited to participate in a panel discussion at Cambridge University about media accountability and public response. The other panelists included Prince Harry, who had agreed to discuss the challenges of protecting children in the public eye. The conversation was respectful and constructive, focusing on lessons learned rather than relitigating past grievances. Prince Harry acknowledged that his own comments during the original controversy had probably contributed to the intensity of the public reaction. We all learned something from this situation, Prince Harry said during the discussion. John learned to be more careful with his words, the media learned about the power of their platforms, and, hopefully, society learned something about the difference between justice and revenge. John's response had been measured and thoughtful. I'm grateful that something constructive has come from my mistake. If my experience helps people think more carefully about proportionality and consequences, then maybe some good came from something that began with poor judgment. The panel discussion had been attended by journalism students, media professionals, and members of the public who were interested in the broader questions the controversy had raised. Many attendees remarked afterward that they had learned as much about human nature and social dynamics as they had about media ethics. As John reflected on the year since his comment had changed his life, he realized that while he would always regret his thoughtless words, the experience had ultimately led to growth and understanding that might not have occurred otherwise. He had learned about resilience, humility, and the complexity of human judgment. His family had become closer and more appreciative of what truly mattered. Most importantly, the controversy had contributed to a broader conversation about how society could handle mistakes and accountability more thoughtfully. While the immediate aftermath had been destructive, the longer-term impact might be constructive if people learned to distinguish between justice and revenge, between accountability and destruction. The question that had haunted John throughout the controversy, whether the public reaction had been proportionate to his mistake, remained complex and subjective. But the year that followed had demonstrated that growth, learning, and redemption were possible even after serious errors in judgment. Prince George, now 11, had thrived despite being at the center of the initial controversy. His resilience and the support of his family had allowed him to learn positive lessons about handling adversity and not allowing other people's words to define his self-worth. As the anniversary passed quietly, it was clear that while 7 thoughtless words had caused significant pain and disruption, the human capacity for growth, forgiveness, and learning had ultimately prevailed. The story had become less about John Thompson's mistake and more about society's ongoing struggle to balance accountability with compassion, justice with mercy, and immediate satisfaction with long-term wisdom. The final lesson might be that in our rush to judge and punish, we sometimes forget the more difficult but more important work of understanding, learning, and growing together as a community capable of both holding people accountable and offering them paths to redemption.